Red delicious. They used to be delicious, but not so much anymore. How do they go from spending 70 years as America's favourite apple to today, where they're not even stocked at my local supermarket? I've come to the Belkin Family Lookout Farm, one of the oldest in Massachusetts, to find out what happened. Who killed the Red Delicious? Our story begins 10,000 years ago in the Chenchan Mountains of Kazakhstan, with a species of tree known as the Malus cerevisiae. It produced fruits which were similar enough to modern apples for you to see the resemblance, but they also tasted pretty terrible. Best left for cooking with rather than eating raw. Eventually, some seeds from the tree made their way to Europe, and it is at this point, with the European love of all things sweet, which work began on mutating the apple. If you're familiar with Charles Darwin's theory of evolution by natural selection, then you'll be aware that if parents have some useful characteristics, they're likely to pass on these traits to some of their children. We can also do this artificially through selective breeding. For example, if I have one ugly pumpkin and were to manually cross-pollinate it with another ugly pumpkin, then they're likely to produce some very ugly crops. If we were to then get one of these very ugly pumpkins and manually crossbreed it with a very large pumpkin, well, then we're likely to end up with something a bit like this. Over the centuries, we've used this technique on pretty much everything we eat, except, as it turns out, for apples. Apples' seeds are extreme heterozygotes. That means their genetic makeup includes variations which combine randomly to cause significant differences in characteristics to each apple's parent. In order to make better tasting apples, the only option is to plant thousands of seeds and test out fruit from every single tree. Once you have one which tastes okay, you clone that individual by taking a wood sample and grafting it to the rootstock of another tree. We call a collection of cloned apple trees a cultivar. If you have one apple from one tree and another apple from a different tree, and they're from the same cultivar, then they're going to taste and look identical, because they're clones of the same individual. Occasionally, a grafted individual isn't quite the same as its parent, which allows farmers to select for certain traits. In 1620, settlers landing in Massachusetts brought with them a selection of English cultivars. Unfortunately, most couldn't survive in the new conditions, so it had to be abandoned. People still grew apples from seeds, and although these didn't taste very nice for eating, they were great for making cider with, which was by all accounts a very lucky thing. Occasionally, due to pure genetic fluke, an apple would come along producing nice tasting fruit that could also survive in these conditions. That was something worth cloning. With this rather haphazard approach, America eventually came to produce 15,000 varieties of locally developed cultivars. Some of these tasted so good that they could be shipped back to the old world, fetching a price up to 10 times that of the local English variety. One of these, a hero among apples, was called the Hawkeye, later rebranded as Stark Delicious, and finally to Red Delicious. It's a good point to note that at this point it truly was delicious, heralded by some as the greatest apple of any time. As America became more urbanized in the 1900s, people started getting their produce from the grocers rather than the farmers which grew them. Rather than stocking all 15,000 cultivars of American apple, instead grocers selected just one, that of course being the Red Delicious. There are three factors you need to juggle when selling apple in the shops. First of these is taste. While you may think that it's the most important, since it's not a factor you can test out till after paying for it, it really goes by the wayside. Next, we have appearance. People want a nice, bright, lipstick red apple, like the one that Sleeping Beauty ate, because obviously that was really good for her. Originally, Red Delicious had these weird yellow patches, so obviously they had to go. As it turns out, the gene which gave them this yellow coloration is also the same gene which gave them flavour. So we bred for some really nice looking, but ultimately very bland tasting apples. Finally, people don't want to pay all that much for their produce. In order to save money on transportation costs and to stop them bruising, farmers went for an apple that had thick skin and mushy interior, making them bruise resistant, but also taking away the entire experience of eating a nice crisp apple. Over the decades, we got an apple that looked good and was really cheap, but unfortunately didn't taste all that nice. Our hero had turned into a villain. By this point, most of America's old-school cultivars had long since been abandoned, leaving us with no viable alternative. Someone would have to create their own. That someone was a man named David Bedford and a team from the University of Minnesota. Starting in the 1980s, they spent 30 years trying to brute force their way to the perfect apple, some days testing out 500 different fruit. Eventually, they succeeded with this one. It tasted honeyed and had a crispy texture to it, so they called it the Honeycrisp. Soon, orchards all over the country were growing it, but many of these were selecting for an apple which looked better and tasted worse. David was furious. It was told that the Honeycrisp would destroy the Red Delicious, not join them. In secret, he and his team began work on another apple, eventually succeeding a couple of years later with the Sweet Tango. This time, they took out a trademark on the name Sweet Tango, which would mean that you could only sell your apple as a Sweet Tango if it actually tasted like one. Now, customers could buy based on brand recognition rather than looks alone. With these building blocks in place, soon new apples exploded onto the market, backed up with some insane investment and rather good advertising. Under the onslaught of objectively better competition, it was only a matter of time before Red Delicious was defeated. In a way, the story of the apple is also the story of America. Arriving in a strange new land, initially surviving here was difficult, but soon people and their orchards were able to thrive. It's a country built on its diversity and made great by some truly fantastic innovators. Was long-term sustainability ever sacrificed for short-term profit? Yeah, of course it was. But at least for now, it looks like things are tending up. Apples. As American as an apple pie. Until next time, this has been James Dingley from the Atomic Frontier. Keep looking up.